Glad to have you here. Hi, I'm Rudy Maxa. Glad to have you here. This is the latest episode of I Was Just Thinking, and I've got a riveting guest for you today who has written a riveting book about the history of the Savoy Hotel in London, one of the world's great hotels. Her name is Olivia Williams. I'll introduce you to in just a moment. In fact, I'll bring her in right now if Tommy will do that for me. Hi, Olivia. I'm Rudy. How do you do?
Hi.
We reach Olivia in London today. She is English. As befits someone who wrote a book about the Savoy. And many years ago, she visited the ancestral home of the founder of the Savoy Hotel in Devon, in southwestern England, and was so impressed by the home, she went into the gift shop and was looking for perhaps a book with the history of the family that owned the home. I think it was on 23 acres or so. And she didn't find one, so she decided to write one, as befits a journalist. She is a journalist. She has a background in journalism, even though you graduated with a degree in what from Oxford, didn't you?
History. So quite unusually, I got to directly use my history degree, which I don't think many history graduates get to do.
Well, I think your history degree. Then you went to work as a beginning reporter at the Daily Mail in London, and I think your background in history is reflected in your book. Because you really present a vivid history of this hotel, opening with a murder, by the way, in the hotel. This is a book about scandal, about family rivalry, about a hotel that was built on the profits from one music promoter's liaison with Gilbert and Sullivan. I'm sure you all remember Gilbert and Sullivan. They were Victorian era musician and lyricist, and I wrote, among other things, The Mikado, the HMS Pinafore, the Pirates of Penzance, et cetera, et cetera. And that is that is really the basis of the fortune for this particular hotel. So begin with visiting this home. Describe what the home was that so captivated you.
Well, it was off the back of my first book, which is a history book about gin, the drink. So I went to Plymouth Distillery, which is in the southwest of England as well. I don't know if Plymouth gin is popular in America, but it's one of the oldest gin distilleries in the world. And so I went there off the back of my first book, and then I decided to make a holiday out of being in the southwest of England. So after I went to Plymouth, I went on, which incidentally, I mean, lots of places claim to, but it claims to be one of the places where the Pilgrims started on the Mayflower, hence Plymouth Rock. So yeah, I started there, and then I went on holiday, and I went to look around the Doyle Carts family home, which is now open to the public, and it's run by the National Trust, so anyone can go and see it. And it was just really a little world of its own. It's very hard to find if you don't know where you're going. It's down a lot of windy country lanes. And then you suddenly open up. It's in a valley by itself, and it opens up, and the sea is visible from the house at the end. And it's quite breathtaking when you first see it. And when I was looking around the house, I was kind of intrigued by what kind of people would have built a country house from scratch in the 1920s, because it was quite unusual to have the money to do that, because a lot of aristocrats were down on their luck in the 1920s. So I was kind of intrigued that someone had the money to do that. And then I was also intrigued when I went inside, because on the outside it looks quite Victorian, and on the inside it's pretty much Art Deco, one of the earliest examples of Art Deco you can find in the world. So I liked that it was different on the outside and different on the inside. And
I was going to say the patriarch has a very unusual name. You gave it very quickly. Richard Doyle Carts. What kind of name is that?
Well, it's slightly made up. Oh, there he is.
There he is. Yes, in his finery.
Yeah, it's a slightly made up name, because he should have just been Richard Cart with no E at the end. But his father added an E to make it more stylish and sound more French. And then Doyle is his middle name, which is from his mother's side, from a kind of Norman lineage that she was proud of.
Can you spell Doyle for us, please?
Yeah, D''Oyly. Very weird. Which is a name of Norman descent. So then he put them together. So instead of being Richard Cart, he was Richard Doyle Cart, which is a bit more distinctive. And then they basically used it as a double barrel surname. So then his children and his grandchildren had that name too.
So he started out with an interest in music and eventually came to be representing some musicians. He met Gilbert, he met Sullivan, and they started with him lashing them all along the way. They started writing what came to be called light operas. What's a light opera?
Well, it's what Richard was aiming for was basically what he had tried to write himself and not really succeeded. So then he realized he needed some other talented people to make this vision of his come true. And it was supposed to be imitating French style, which is you use opera, but it's in a native language that the audience will understand. And it can be quite frivolous, and it's supposed to be very entertaining and accessible. So it was supposed to be a kind of middle class, accessible version of opera, but with the music just as, on point and flowery, but the language to be something that people could actually understand and follow all the way through, rather than kind of appreciating the atmosphere but not really understanding what was going on.
And Olivia, I'm terribly sorry. I introduced you as the author of the book and didn't give the title of the book. I think Tommy can put it up here. It's called The Secret Life of the Savoy, and Olivia Williams is the author. I'm terribly sorry I didn't identify the book. That's every interviewer's first job when talking to an author, because we're going to sell some books here probably. So you describe a portrait or a picture of that time in the late 1800s. The theaters in England it wasn't the West End. They're fairly shabby places. And Doyle Cart wanted to really have a better place. And Gilbert and Sullivan wound up being his ticket, I gather. And not only were they successful in England and on the continent, but he shipped him over to Europe and put him on a Death March promotion tour, providing these things, and made a lot of money, didn't he?
Yeah, he liked to do that with his clients. He started off as a talent manager, so not just for Gilbert and Sullivan. He also did it for poets and writers, including Oscar Wilde. And
Oscar Wilde is a favorite of mine, and certainly a favorite of many Americans. So he met Oscar Wilde, was intrigued by him, and sent him on a lecture tour. I mean, that just, again, went a killer schedule through America, and Oscar Wilde made a lot of money and made a lot of funny comments, and Americans loved him. So again, we're not even to the Savoy Hotel yet. This is the foundation for Doyle Carts' fortune, basically.
Yeah, at this stage, he hasn't even dreamt up the possibility of a hotel. He is just trying to work his clients as hard as he possibly can to make them and him some money. And he seems to have a gift for understanding what is going to have sort of mass popularity, like Gilbert and Sullivan or Oscar Wilde. And then they all start off complaining that the workload is impossible, but then they become so successful that generally they start to pipe down and they just kind of get on with it.
And collect the money.
But I think Richard was so energetic and such a perfectionist. I think he didn't really understand that anyone else might not feel like that. So he didn't really listen if there were complaints. I think he expected everyone to work as hard as he did.
So there was a plot of land near the Thames River that had been a famous site and home for royalty, and it fallen in total disrepair. And he admired that site, and that's where he chose to build his theater. And please describe how different his theater was compared to what existed at that time in the late 1800s in London.
Well, before he had money to build a theatre from scratch, he had to lease a theatre like any other impresario would have at the time. And it didn't fit his vision of a respectable place where people could dress up and enjoy an intelligent evening out. These places a lot of them were kind of half falling down. The actors and actresses were not professionals in the sense that it wasn't necessarily their full-time job. It was completely improvised. There were no kind of strict rehearsal schedules, which he instigated, as you might imagine. the sets were not properly thought through. They weren't realistic. He spent a lot of money on the costumes and the set design, and people were drilled constantly with rehearsals, which they weren't used to either. And a lot of them, the audience would be in the same light as the stage, and they would be making plenty of noise and chatting amongst themselves. And because Richard took it so seriously, he was one of the first people who had a pitch black auditorium, expected total silence while the performers were busy. There was no idea that you could carry on a conversation or mess around during the performance, which was a bit of a shock for people who are used to, carrying on their socializing basically while they were watching something. So it was a very different experience going to watch one of his productions to most of the things that were available.
He was a perfectionist par excellence. And of course, that would serve him very well later when he built his very fancy theater, which is still there, by the way, connected to the Savoy Hotel, if you visit the Savoy in London. So first he starts with a theater, very elaborate, very fancy, marble. Something that London had never seen before for a theater. Because what he wanted to do is he wanted to attract royalty, big names, society. He was one of the first to, well, we'll get into that later when we talk about the hotel. But I gather it was the first thing he built. Did he build a restaurant adjoining it first?
Yeah, so there's, which also still exists, there's Simpson's on the Strand, which he bought from someone else. And it started off as a cigar lounge where people could play, men only could play chess. And he made it into somewhere that men and women could socialize separately, and made it into a proper restaurant. And he was one of the people who pioneered the idea of, because he had a vision of a whole night out experience for theatre goers. So there was a pre-theatre menu, which we're quite familiar with now. And then he provided the bar in the interval, and he didn't want anyone else to run it because it was normal to rent out the bar to anyone who wanted to pay to run your theatre bar. But he didn't want anyone else to do that, so he wanted to run it himself. And then the final part of the vision was what he ended up doing, which is having somewhere for people to stay after they'd been to see the show. So then the theatre predated the hotel, and they're adjoining because he was hoping that people would come and see a Gilbert and Sullivan production of his at the Savoy Theatre, maybe eat at Simpson's in the Strand, and then hopefully go to sleep afterwards in his new hotel.
How did he know? Because we'll get into the details of the hotel very shortly, but it was uber luxurious for London at the time. Hotels were almost places of ill repute at times, but how did he know about luxury hotels and what would make a luxury hotel before he even designed it and built it?
Well, he was very impressed when he went on tour with Gilbert and Sullivan. As you said, they were popular all over continental Europe and America, and further afield in Australia and other places as well. And he would go on tour with them to all of these places. And he started to feel as though when he went back to London, that there wasn't anything comparable to what he had seen in Monte Carlo and Cannes and Baden-Baden in Germany. And he was starting to feel as though there are enough wealthy people in London who would pay for something as spectacular as he had seen in France and Monaco and Germany. So he put together, while he was enjoying all of these restaurants and hotels, he started to put together what he liked from each place. And he also started looking into the staff behind these places and working out who were the magic people who were making these places work so well. And then eventually, when he was ready, he started poaching people and trying to convince them to come to London, which was quite tricky at the time because it wasn't considered a tourist place. And because of the English Channel, it wasn't a natural part of the loop and the tour that people did, that wealthy people used to do in the summer. So he felt like he had this obstacle of trying to get people over from continental Europe, convince them that London was somewhere where they would want to spend a holiday, because at the time it had a bit of a reputation for being somewhere quite functional. and the entertainment and places to stay and the restaurants were all a bit behind. So he had quite a lot of work to do.
He was the first to bring electricity into a theater. He had electrical lights for the stage, which was very, very radical at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, he was the first to electrify a hotel. And I was shocked at, first of all, he made the rooms very luxurious in what would become the Savoy. And he had an unusual amount of ensuite bathrooms actually in the rooms. You mentioned that at the time, one of the luxury hotels had 500 rooms with 2 bathrooms. I don't want to even think about that.
Well, the expectation was that the servants would manually basically run up and down the stairs, filling a tin bath in the room, so that there wouldn't be a fixed fitted bathroom. There would just be a tub that some servant would have to fill very laboriously. So yeah, the idea of ensuite bathrooms was completely new in Britain at the time, and it was something that he'd seen in one hotel in America and decided to go for it. And as we said, being a perfectionist, he also used to sit in the bathtubs in showrooms to check that they were comfortable and the right height in his full suit and outfit, just climb in and check that it was what he wanted.
Did you get my guest Olivia Williams is the author of a book just published in America called The Secret Life of the Savoy, which is a fascinating story. Even if you're not an Anglophile, you will definitely enjoy it. Did you ever get a sense of Doyle Carts' personality? I know he worked very hard. You made it very clear. The guy was driven all the time, always working, always pushing, a tough negotiator. Was he a fun guy?
Yeah, definitely. He was. I think he was basically threw himself at everything. So yeah, he did know how to have fun, definitely. And he took having fun seriously, if that makes any sense. Like, he made a kind of art out of it. And that's part of the reason why he and Arthur Sullivan were so close, because they were both obviously partners in the music and that they were creating. And Richard Doyle Carts was completely in admiration of his best friend for what he could compose. But then in their leisure time, they spent a lot of their time together around Monaco and south of France. And I mean, I think Richard was luckily more disciplined than Arthur Sullivan, because it was always Richard who then said, okay, we've had enough fun now, it's time to get back on with another operetta. So he had his work cut out making his friend get back to work every time. But yeah, he definitely enjoyed himself and spent his money freely and enjoyed it properly.
He had 2 children, 2 sons. One wife died fairly young, and he then eventually married a woman who worked in his company, who really sort of became his right hand, I gather. As an aside, you will enjoy in Olivia's book the interplay between Gilbert and Sullivan. They were totally different personalities, and they didn't always get along. And one would resent the other, and the other would resent the other one, and so on. But it's an interesting little side plot to the book. All right, so there was an opening of the Savoy. When did the Savoy open? Do you know the year by memory?
Summer of 1889.
1889. And this was an opening and a hotel, the likes of which London had never seen. Can you give us a splash of color for what this opening was like, how people were treated, what awaited them when they showed up?
Well, also being Richard, he had 3 opening parties. One was for the investors who he had persuaded to put up money for this huge venture. One was for the press, and then one was a bigger party for a lot more people, because it's a huge hotel if you haven't seen it. And his most intimate party was involved a night at the opera, and then carriages took the guests from Covent Garden, which is the traditional home of highbrow opera, sort of sort of more serious traditional opera. He paid for everyone to go to that. And then the carriages brought them round to the riverside entrance of the Savoy Hotel, which was very pretty because it was all gaslit on the outside and it reflects in the River Thames. And then they all walked in. It used to have a huge courtyard, which has been filled in now, sadly. But so they walked into this sort of alfresco garden in the middle of London, which was completely unusual as well. And then they had a dinner that started at 11 p.m. and then they carried on drinking and partying through the evening. And he had secured all of the aristocrats that he wanted. He managed to get a good mix of, he wanted some business people as well. So he had the Rothschilds and the Forbes. And so he had a kind of mix of old and new money, which is what he was hoping he would attract when the hotel opened properly.
It was a show. It was a good show, wasn't it? He was staging a show. Exactly.
I mean, it was called a housewarming party, but I think it was a lot less low-key than that. And he and his wife were there to greet every single person coming in. So the idea was really that you were guests of theirs in effectively a sort of scaled-up version of their house. And they had this idea that, which hopefully is stuck all the way through, that you're dealing with guests, not customers. You're supposed to be treating these people as though they are going to be your friends if they're not your friends already.
And they're in your home.
Yeah, exactly. So
it was a radical concept for hoteliering, at least in the UK, at London at that time.
And because he had chosen, all of the taste was very closely his as well. So he had really spent all this money creating a kind of scaled up version of his own house. And it was all very personal to him.
And he was one of the first, certainly respectable hoteliers to allow unaccompanied women, unless they were prostitutes, basically, unaccompanied women to come and eat at the hotel, to stay in the hotel. They didn't have to be accompanied by a man. That was pretty radical at the time, I gather.
Yeah, well, they were quite nervous about the idea. So they started off with putting screens around the women in case it offended
the dining room,
the diners. Yeah,
right.
And then I think when they realised that it was going to be okay, they took the screens away. But I think it suggests how nervous they were when they were starting. He'd had an earlier foray with the theatre where he also wanted women to be able to come unaccompanied to the theatre. So it had become a bit of a theme, and he thought that it was a rich seam of people who could spend money, all these, wives and daughters who weren't supposed to be going out on their own. And he thought that it would be great if they actually could, and they could come to his theatre and hotel and spend money there.
And he had this acute interest in attracting Americans. Was that just about money, or did he want to be recognized and be famous in America? Or?
Well, I think partly because he'd made so much of his fortune in America. It was when the Pirates of Penzance took over transatlantically that he became he went into a completely different league, and so did Gilbert and Sullivan. It kind of changed their lives, really, being successful in America. And I think he was also really impressed by all the technology and the attitudes, and I think he just really wanted to replicate that. And he felt like a lot of the most sophisticated things were happening in America, and he was very passionate about basically finding the most sophisticated, stylish things that he could all the time. So if he could find them in Europe or he could find them in America, he just wanted to bring all of those people over and impress them. That was his sort of big mission.
And it was slow going at first, I gather, the first year.
Yeah, well, it wasn't just a sort of fond idea that it was friends coming to stay. I mean, it actually was friends coming to stay out of necessity, because he needed to fill the rooms, because people really hadn't sort of set up the idea of London as a tourist place yet. So there was only a kind of domestic market that he could rely on. And he wasn't sure if people were used to paying that much. The food was quite exotic by some people's standards, and confused some people. It was quite intimidating atmosphere because of the dress code and the formality. So yeah, he had a lot of his friends staying, long term to fill up the rooms to start with, and he was really nervous that, despite having had a very successful party and an opening which created lots of headlines, the only thing that would actually save the place is if people kept on coming and paying to come, rather than just coming, having a look, thinking, wow, this is great, and then disappearing again. Like, he needed people to be there all year, every year.
My guest is Olivia Williams. We're talking about her new book, The Secret Life of or new book in the United States anyway, The Secret Life of the Savoy Hotel. If you've been to it in London, you might know that as you approach the hotel on what's called the neighborhood called the Strand, on the right is a theater, a legitimate theater, which the founder, Richard Doyle Carts, there it is, right there. You might notice that the cars are driving in on the right side. And of course, in London, you drive on the left side of the road, not the right side. And the cars are coming out on the wrong side by London standards. It is the only street is too big a word. It's more like an alley. The entrance to the hotel is to the right. The theater is to the right. The reason they got an exemption by law, and I just say it because I know Olivia could tell you as well, or she told me in her book, that he got permission for the cars to drive in on the right lane so that the guests getting out of carriages or cars could get under cover and into the theater should it be raining. Not that it ever rains in London, of course. And so to this day, you will find suddenly you're driving in on the right side of the road and coming out on the opposite side against all prevailing traffic in not just in the UK but elsewhere in that part of the world. He thought of everything, didn't he? He really thought of everything. And so for a year he sort of struggled, but then he went to the continent and he poached a guy whose name is fairly well known, Cesar Ritz, from his perch. Where was he? Was he in Rome at the time?
He was in Monte Carlo at the time.
Monte Carlo, right. And he wasn't about to move. He wasn't about to budge, but Doyle kept on him.
Yeah. It was a prolonged charm offensive that eventually got Ritz to come over, and Doyle, sorry, I call him Doyle because his friends used to call him Doyle. Richard Doyle Carts eventually persuaded him to come over for just a fortnight, which was a big step down from the initial, please move over here permanently and run my hotel, which was his initial pitch. He got down to pleading with him to come for a fortnight and paying him to come as well. But then luckily he did manage to impress Cesar Ritz so much that he did actually agree to come and manage the hotel, which Richard Doyle Carts really thought was the key to unlocking everything, because Ritz was really well connected on the continent and he was really the kind of arbiter of everything stylish and continental, and he had the most incredible address book from his time in France and in Monaco, and Doyle really was kind of paying for access to that address book and for Ritz's seal of approval on the place. And he also thought that Ritz ran things immaculately, and that was exactly what he wanted. And he couldn't find anyone British who he really thought understood exactly what he was trying to do. So it was a huge moment for him that he managed to get Ritz to come and run the hotel for him. It worked. And then Ritz had a buddy who was pretty good in the kitchen, whose name we also know in the United States, who he convinced to come and leave his very exalted post in Paris. Yeah, they were a kind of double act. Auguste Escoffier, who didn't speak English kind of on purpose because he didn't really kind of want to. So Cesar Ritz. When you're Auguste Escoffier in Paris. Exactly. Also, he said he didn't want to start speaking English because he would end up cooking like them. That's a great line. So yeah, he had like a healthy disdain for London, and Ritz had to persuade him, having been persuaded by Richard Doyle Carts, that this was a good idea and not going to ruin their reputation. So yeah, they came over as a double act. So then, and Richard it worked. Yeah, so Richard had the best chef in the world, as he thought, and the best hotel manager in the world as well. So he ticked both of those boxes they'd been desperate to tick since it opened. And the fans of those two men, of Escoffier for his cooking and Ritz for his hoteliering, they brought in the Rolodex. They brought in their big names. They brought in their past clients, and suddenly the Savoy was. Well, I know one author once called the Savoy the beginning of the leisure class. The idea that you could go to a hotel and enjoy an evening and have an opulent dinner at a very high price, but an incredible dinner for 3 or 4 hours, and
There was even a bar. It's still there. It's one of the most famous bars in the world, called the American Bar. It's one of the things that was not 2007, which we'll get to later, but it's still there, the American Bar. You need to get reservations to get in. Generally, you can sometimes walk in. But he wanted the American Bar to draw the Americans. He wanted a whole international set, and it worked. Now, I guess we should explain what happened to what Escoffier and Ritz were doing, sort of with their left hand the whole time they were working for Oily Cart. They were not exactly, the books were being cooked.
Yeah, exactly. It went on for a few years, and I don't know if Richard Doyle Carts just didn't want to face up to it because he was so thrilled to have them, and he had put so much into it. And it kind of seems unlikely that he didn't notice that there were some financial irregularities, because he wasn't, he wasn't a lazy hotel owner. So I'm sure he noticed there was something wrong with the books at the kitchen. But then it turned out there was a whistleblower who got in touch, and then I think there wasn't really any way of turning a blind eye to what was going on anymore. And I think probably the scale of it maybe was a surprise.
What was going on, Olivia?
Well, it amounted, they managed to reclaim hundreds and thousands of pounds off the two of them, but basically they were taking, I guess, essentially, because it wouldn't have happened in Britain at the time much, essentially taking bribes from suppliers to use them, and basically saying that they would change suppliers if they didn't personally pay Ritz and Escoffier a fee, which wasn't common then. And
in America, we call those kickbacks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Weren't there bottles of wine and great quantities of food also somehow evaporating out of the hotel without accounting?
Yeah, wine and food disappearing. Turned out that they were also getting the suppliers to provide their personal houses with food and drinks as well. And there was quite a few irregularities with people who favoured guests who didn't seem to be paying, and Ritz seemed to be letting them off ever paying their bills, which was becoming quite a problem as well, because they were owed quite a lot of money by regulars. So I don't know what his arrangement was there, but it showed a big gap between what people were apparently going to be paying at some point that never materialized.
And then Richard Doyle, what's his last name?
Cart,
C-A-R-T, with an E on the end to give it a little international flair. Richard Doyle Carts decided to expand. He already owned Simpson on the Strand, which is it's still there, isn't it, Olivia?
Yeah.
He owned the theater and the connected hotel that is still one of the world's best. It's actually a Fairmont hotel now, so if you get points for staying at Fairmont, you can, when you pay your £450 or £700 a night to stay at the hotel, you'll get your points. But he decided to put hotels elsewhere around the world. Can you remember some of the places that he established a beachhead?
Well, he started off quite nearby, so he expanded into Mayfair with Claridge's. That was his first idea, which he built from scratch because he knocked down the boarding house that had been there before. So he can also claim Claridge's, even though he sort of used the name from something else. He took over a hotel in Rome that was half built and the people ran out of money, so he bought that. And then he also later bought the Connaught Hotel, which is also in Mayfair. And then later,
Paris, didn't he?
Yeah.
His favorite.
Well, the Parisian one was actually a lot later, I think.
Oh, okay. And those eventually were sold off, but he apparently did fairly well on those. What surprised me was that when World War I came, and then he died before World War I. He died in early 1900s, did he not?
Yeah, he was just 56. He died in 1901.
and his son took over, whose name starts with a D. What is it?
Rupert.
No, Rupert, right. Rupert took over, and he was a chip off the old block. He was a perfectionist like his father. He had started work in the hotel, and I was very surprised the hotel stayed open all through World War I. And when we were talking before you came on, the hotel also went through World War II with open doors. London was heavily bombed in those days. It's particularly World War II.
Yeah, the hotel had some direct hits. The windows were blown out more than once, and because also it was in quite a vulnerable position on the river.
Sure.
And also they had to keep going through rationing, which is pretty difficult for a luxury hotel. And then whenever there were bomb raids during the Blitz, the guests had to be relocated to a bomb shelter, which they had to custom build and try and make luxurious as well. So there were plenty of difficulties, and also the staff shortages, because obviously people kept being drawn into the war directly. So yeah, it was pretty tough keeping a luxury enterprise going during the Second World War, but they managed.
Let's define luxury. Could I ask you to read something, the paragraph I called your attention earlier to us? The lavishness of the parties, the money spent, quite incredible. Will you be kind enough to read this one paragraph describing a party for an American importer named wine importer, I think, named George Kessler. In fact, you can still find Kessler wines in the United States. The name continues. So please, would you read that paragraph to us about the party for George Kessler?
I didn't realize Kessler was still around. That's good to know.
I think Kessler wine still is. I didn't look it up, but it's a very familiar name to me. So.
One particularly good customer was New York champagne importer George A. Kessler. Fancy dress was fashionable in Edwardian London, and Kessler's party highlight of 1905 was a Gondoliers-themed birthday dinner. Before Rupert transformed his father's courtyard into the Lancaster Ballroom, for Kessler's birthday, the hotel obligingly filled the courtyard to a depth of 4 feet to conjure the Grand Canal of Venice by the Thames. The banqueting department painted frescoes in front of its walls, strung up fairy lights to illuminate the night sky, and dressed the waiters as gondoliers. Dinner was served on a gilded, silk-lined floating gondola, covered in carnations in the middle of the canal. Real swans were swimming in the water, or at least they were at the beginning. They fell ill from the chemicals that tinted it blue and were scooped out. Once the ailing swans were out of the way, Savoy regular, the Neapolitan tenor Enrico Caruso, serenaded the guests under a paper moon while 100 white doves were released to flutter above. As a final flourish, a baby elephant, borrowed from London Zoo, pulled a 5-foot-high birthday cake up the little bridge and onto the gondola. As an accompaniment, Caruso warbled O Sole Mio. There was no such thing as overkill at the Edwardian Savoy.
That is an understatement. No such overkill. I mean, Enrico Caruso singing at your party, and 100 doves alone cost money. I mean, the elephant wasn't cheap probably either. And I mean, creating a fake Venetian canal right there. I love the poor swans. I didn't know they'd colored the water blue so that it didn't look brown like the Thames always does. The wretched, I mean, we had an expression for it when I worked at a magazine called Spy. We used to call it wretched excess. And that was maybe not every day, but it was a constant at this hotel. This was not the only over the top party.
No, I think it also picks up on how useful in a way it was that the family who owned the place had this theatre background, because they treated what they were doing, as you can probably tell from that description, as a piece of theatre. And I think that's what made it so successful at the beginning, is that they really knew how to create a sense of occasion. And they saw that through in the parties, and they also made sure that happened when they designed the hotel as well. So they put in extra steps that were not needed up and down into the bar and the restaurant, so that people could make an entrance and walk down the stairs when they didn't need to. But it was good because then the tables were all formed in a way that everyone could watch as people came in. And obviously, when you know that you're going to be watched by all of these people are dressing up. So they were really good at creating this theatrical sense of occasion that you would want when you go to a luxury hotel. They completely understood that.
Very important to keep up with the keeper-uppers and to be seen, see and be seen. And the family Cart understood that and certainly did it. His son Rupert carried on, apparently with quite successfully, following in his father's footsteps, didn't he?
Well, I think he was kind of a more serious person maybe than his father, and he was quite shy, as I guess maybe a lot of children of famous people might be. Like, he wasn't quite so, he's sort of put in the limelight rather than having decided to be there. So he was quite private. A lot of the staff didn't really feel as though they knew him particularly well, but he was a very shrewd business person, and he was also very intelligent, like his father, in thinking how to take the hotel way beyond even people who would come to stay. So he thought of the Savoy cocktail book, which was a big seller in countries all around the world. And I think it's still the best-selling cocktail book in history.
Really?
It's never been out of print since the 1920s. And that was great because people who might never get to go to the American bar, maybe could never afford there or might never come to London, they would still know about the Savoy because they could buy the book. And similarly, they had, he pioneered the idea of these really world-class in-house hotel bands that he would put together and supervise. So the Savoy Havana band had record deals. It was one of the earliest radio broadcasts would be broadcast from the Savoy ballroom. People, again, who may never go to the hotel, may never go to London, could sit at home and listen to the sound of what it would be like to be at the Savoy.
This is what it sounds like to be wealthy. Right? Right. And wasn't it one of the first hotels to have dancing?
Yeah, so they had the dinner dances, which they pioneered. They had a lot of dance premieres as well. They would get professional dancers from around the world to come and show people how to do the most fashionable new dance that they had never heard of yet. So they would be watching the tango by some, world people who just won some world dancing competition would come and show them how it was done. And they had, they could come and have dinner and then also listen to people whose records they might have heard bought at home. And see them firsthand as well.
So unaccompanied women permitted, bathtubs with actually running water, electrical lights, grand galas. We'll talk about who owns the hotel now in just a moment. But do famous people and celebrities still stay do you see? Are they still populating gossip columns in the English tabloids of who checked into the Savoy or who didn't or what happened?
Yeah, I think there's always, with luxury hotels, they've always had quite a tricky balancing act because they want famous people to come and stay, obviously, but there are some famous people who are happy to carry on publicizing themselves while they're at the hotel, but then there are others who want complete discretion and they would not be at all happy that any details of their stay would be discussed. So I think that's part of the talent of running a luxury hotel, is knowing when people want publicity and when they don't.
Exactly. You always should. And you, Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse about being talked about all the time is having no one talk about you. One of his famous quotes. And Oscar Wilde, of course, was a good friend of Doyle, if you don't mind my calling him to Mr. Cart. You opened the book with a murder. Not necessarily great publicity for the hotel, but it seemed to work out. This was a French, what did you call her?
Did I find something polite to call her?
You did find something polite, yes. And I remembered it. I thought of it this morning, but it went out of my mind. I'd have to look in the book very quickly. Anyway, she was a French woman of leisure and apparently well known and had many boyfriends. And her latest boyfriend was this much younger man, some Italian count or something. I don't know. He had some kind of title from Italy. And they got married, but he kept a close eye on her, and they fought all the time. And one night she took a pistol, which she'd have under a pillow, and in the hallway of the Savoy, basically blew his brains out. Bad publicity for a hotel, but it didn't turn out badly, did it?
No. So I think partly because she happened to be very glamorous and well dressed when she turned up at court, it became for her murder trial. That became actually sort of in a slightly perverse, seedy way, quite good publicity. She was absolutely covered in jewelry. She had shot him wearing a white Chanel dress that was then covered in blood, so that was quite dramatic. And and then as part of the murder trial, the how wonderful their holiday had been until she murdered him basically came up, so people could read all about the details of what it would be like to spend your extended honeymoon at the Savoy Hotel. So in a strange way, because she was describing the sort of run up to the murder, people could really get a sense of what an extravagant, amazing time they had been having until she did that.
And what was the verdict, Ms. Williams?
She was let off, which was really quite shocking. I think his family were completely shocked as well, because it was, well, she was let off as a heat of the moment, not premeditated murder.
Yeah, couldn't help herself.
And she lived out her days in her Paris apartment opposite the Ritz in Paris.
In Paris, yeah. Ironically called the Ritz. I gather there were a lot of affairs, and there were side entrances and ways that couples could sneak in without being seen. But a lot of affairs involving royalty and mistresses, the various princes. Almost sounds like today in London. Am I wrong?
About the affairs? Ooh.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of things going on in I mean, they probably are in many hotels, but they were going on with titled folks at the Savoy. At least you had that class of folks.
Well, I think this is coming back to that discretion point again, of knowing how to get guests in and out discreetly, offer them side entrances, especially if they were very famous, so that they could avoid any paparazzi, banning any photographs being taken inside the hotel without permission, lots of strict messages to the staff about how important it was that no details were shared of what happened inside the hotel. They had some pretty stern notices sent round. The occasional time when, for example, the royal family, some details of the food that they had been having had been leaked to the press, and that was really worrying for the hotel, because if the royal family stopped coming, then that's a really big blow to the hotel. So they were pretty strict about making sure that the staff were very discreet and made sure they didn't leak anything.
I think you begin one of your sections with a quote from Doyle saying any hotelier that can't keep confidence should find another line of work. But just going back for a moment to the French woman who murdered her younger lover in the hallway there, she'd apparently had an affair earlier with do you remember who?
The teenage Prince Edward.
Right. And there were a lot of letters, and the fixers managed to get a hold of these letters for a price, I think, and destroy them. But it was found when she died in her apartment across from the Ritz that she had kept a couple of letters, as you say, just sort of as insurance. I wonder if that might not have helped her walk free from that courtroom.
I was going to say that. I mean, I didn't know this would be so cynical, but yes, maybe that was why she had such an unusually lenient verdict.
So, Olivia, aren't you a journalist? How could you possibly be cynical? I can understand.
And also the prince had been due to go on a tour of Britain during the trial, and he abruptly changed plans to Canada and disappeared and didn't come back while the trial was going on.
I love it so. Are you welcome through the doors of the hotel, of the Savoy now? Do they love you to death, or?
Yeah, I was lucky. I stayed there we've had quite a few lockdowns, but we had things opened up for a little while in October, I think it was. So I went to stay there. I went to stay the night when they had just reopened. which is really, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised that it was quite busy, but then it went back down into lockdown again pretty quickly afterwards. So hopefully things will be back to normal before long.
Well, let's get to the ending of the hotel. So Rupert takes over, then Rupert dies, and his daughter, right, Bridget? His daughter assumes control of the hotel. Was she? That's Bridget. How was she as a hotelier? Was she as adept as her father and grandfather were?
She was slightly lacking confidence, I would say, because she hadn't expected to inherit everything. She had an older brother, and he had been carefully groomed to take over. But then he had a car accident while he was Rupert sent him on a tour of continental Europe to pick up some good habits for when he would be owning these hotels. But on that trip, his son died. So this left Bridget as the sole heir to everything, which she hadn't expected at all. Her mother had already arranged for her to marry her own cousin, which is not legal anymore, I don't think. So I think the expectation for Bridget was just that she would be married and basically effectively have, joined another family, and they probably wouldn't hear much from her again. But then she was sort of brought back into the fold fairly abruptly when everyone realised that she was the future of all of these businesses now. So I think she wrote that she was pretty daunted when she took over in 1948, but she managed to stay at the helm until the 1980s when she died. So she kept going for 40 years, but I think the sort of innovations that we had seen from the 1880s up to the 1940s, they slowed down quite a lot. I don't think she really wanted to change the formula. I think she saw her role as keeping things as they were. That was her kind of mission, rather than trying to kind of innovate all the time.
So the hotel was sold to, I think, Blackstone, the big investment company out of New York. And in 2007, it closed for about a year or maybe even more, and underwent massive renovations, as I recall. Blackstone Group purchased it. Then in 2004, Quinlan Private who sold the Savoy Hotel in Simpsons for an estimated £250 million pounds to Alaouid bin Talal, and to be managed by his affiliate, Fairmont Hotels and Resorts of Canada. So now it's a Fairmont hotel. That's an interesting route for hotels.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a shame that it's not a family-run business anymore.
How was it when you spent the night there? We only have a couple of minutes left. Was it still up to snuff?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's completely wonderful and luxurious. I think it maybe might have lost some of the quirkiness that it probably had before, because Bridget used to buy all the furniture, and some of it started to be kind of slightly worn out, and she didn't really see that. So again, I think it had that feel of staying in someone's house, in the way that, she liked the furniture. She wouldn't necessarily get rid of things if she, the guests might not like them, but if she liked it, then it would stay. So I think it's probably lost maybe some, inevitably it's lost some of its individuality perhaps, but it's a very slick operation still, which I'm sure they would be proud of.
Well, that is great. Well, it's a fascinating read. If you love hotels, I do a whole lot. I love reading about hotels. This is an eminently readable book by Olivia Williams. It's just a great story after story, and the anecdotes of the family, particularly Oily. No, how do I pronounce his name? You told me Doyley. Particularly Richard Doyle Cart, with an E on the end of Cart. Richard Doyle Cart's shenanigans, his business practices, and the history of the hotel, along with the history of London, is partly told. It's a great read. It's called The Secret Life of the Savoy by Olivia Williams. I'd highly recommend it. Olivia, it's very kind of you to stay up late, or sort of late, in London and spend some time with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will remind viewers, by the way, that we're talking live on the 5th of August, 2021. So mention of COVID and lockups and so on, as Olivia mentioned during the course of the interview, make perfect sense. I'd invite you to receive my newsletter if you'd like. I do an every other week newsletter. It's sort of chatty and gossipy, and so I have some thoughts on travel now and then, and favorite restaurants, and blah 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 blah. Anyway, if you just go to maxatours.com/newsletter, maxatours.com/newsletter, just put in your first and last name and your email, and you'll get it. You will not get besieged. I only write these every other week, and they're, I hope, bite-sized and readable. And we also have posted our 2022 tours. My friend Tommy and I started a tour company in 2019 for some small luxury European tours. We obviously had to shut down in 2020 and most of 2021. We have 2 Christmas tours at the end of this year, last week of November, 1st of December. There are maybe, I think, 2 or 4 slots open on those 2 Christmas tours. Again, these are small group tours. We'll be going to Vienna, stop for the day in Salzburg, go to the Christmas markets, obviously in Vienna and Salzburg, as well as Munich and Zurich. It's a great way to spend to get ready for the Christmas holidays. But then we have a full menu of tours for 2022 that I hope we'll be able to actually take you on. But you can find all those at Maxa Tours. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks. I hope you appreciated Olivia Williams and got a little glimpse into the behind the scenes of a luxury hotel. I'll sign out for now, wishing you happy travels, and best of all, to everyone who's hitting the road these days. I hope we all are soon. Take care. Bye-bye.